Welcome to the Death Talk podcast. The vision for this podcast is to break the culture of silence surrounding death and dying. I'm your host, Lisa Murray. Welcome back to Death Talk podcast. This is Lisa, and today I talked to Benjamin Kintisch. He is the creator behind Life Review, the Hospice Musical. He is also a cantor, a chaplain, and a music teacher. This is the first episode that I'm going to post to both of my podcasts. Some of you know, some of you don't know. I have two podcasts. This one, Death Talk Podcast, and I also have I Have Dreams Dammit, which is sort of the deeper, looking at the deeper kind of journey of going towards our dreams or going towards that feeling and that life that we feel like we're supposed to be living. And that's sort of my main podcast. And this podcast, Death Talk Podcast, was born out of losing people, out of death, and me wanting to continue the conversation about death so that I stay healthy with it. And also I offer that to others as well, to listeners. So because Benjamin had an interesting background with being a musical theater guy, but then also being a chaplain and working in hospice, he sort of followed those breadcrumbs, and that led him to this perfect place, the intersection where they both come together. And that's where this musical was created from. And I talk about this kind of stuff a lot in my other podcast. And, I always say, even in this podcast, you can't talk about death without talking about life. And the main thing that I talk about when it comes to talking about life in the context of our mortality is our dreams and the things that we really feel called to do. It doesn't have to be something specific like starting a restaurant. It could just be listening to a feeling and following that, whatever that is. But it's also one of the things that really helped me when I went through this period of time. I've probably talked about it before in this podcast, but when in my early 20s, late teens, where I all of a sudden out of the blue just started fearing death, extremely. And it wasn't the spiritual part of it anymore, because that's where I was coming from. But it was all of a sudden I just thought about the physical part of death, and it just scared me. And I started having this feeling like this is it, there's nothing else. And it just, I don't know, I just went through this period of time where I was terrified of death. And the only thing that helped me, was when I researched near-death experiences, and in particular, when people would talk about their life reviews. And that was the only thing that really made me feel like, there's a purpose to everything. And maybe we don't understand it right now, but we will one day. And that, that it's important to be a good person. Yeah, so the life review part of the near-death experience was the part that really stood out to me and really healed me. And so when I heard about Benjamin's project, I was like, okay, this is marrying both my worlds together. I need to talk to him. So I really enjoyed this conversation with him, and I hope you do as well. I also broke it up into two parts. Normally, I just have really long episodes on this podcast, but I think, I don't know, just I feel it out. It's an intuitive thing. And I think for this one and a couple other ones I have coming up, I'm going to break them up just because there's a lot. There's a lot that's said that I think is important for people to hear. And so breaking it up in little bite-sized pieces. And I mean, even in broken up, it's still chunky. But yeah, I really enjoy Benjamin's energy. I enjoy what he's doing in his heart. And he's really good too. I mean, this musical, from the songs that I've heard and everything, I'm like, this is really good. He's going to sing two songs for us. One will be in this week's show, and the other one will be in next week's show. And next week, he gets a little bit more into how he's going to be on a virtual world tour with this musical, and a lot more about that. But this first part is just sort of me asking him about himself and his background with death and how he got involved and how this all kind of came about. I hope you enjoy, and I will have all of the links for Benjamin's project on deathtalkpodcast.com on the show notes. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to quickly let you know there is a Positive Death Talk group on Facebook now. You can join that. We can continue the conversation there. You can ask questions, and I would just love to get to know you. So if you want to head over to Facebook, look up Positive Death Talk and join the group. All right, now on with the show. This is episode number 12, and I hope you enjoy. So I'd like to welcome you, Benjamin, but I can call you Ben, right?
Yeah, please, Ben. Thanks. I'm so glad to be here, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. So I love musical, I love theater, and I love talking about death and our life purpose and all those things. So what you're doing, Life Review, the Hospice Musical, was so amazing sounding to me. I had to talk to you. So let's start with, where are you based?
Oh, well, thank you so much. It sounds like it's not surprising based on what you just said that you booked me for this interview, and I hope there's many millions more Americans who also love musicals and death and dying, because then I'll have a big fan base. So hopefully you're not an anomaly that way. I am based in Columbia, Maryland, which is a small planned community. It's sort of like a city, but not quite. Roughly between Baltimore, Maryland, and DC, though a bit closer to Baltimore.
Nice. Did you grow up there?
No, I grew up in Nyack, New York, in the Hudson River Valley.
Wow. So were you always involved in music and or musical theater?
I've loved music and musicals since I was a little boy. I definitely loved musicals as a sort of part of the music that we had available on my parents' phonograph. It's like whatever stuff my parents liked when they were 20 and 30, when they were still buying vinyls, that became the soundtrack to my youth, right? And that included a lot of amazing musical theater, including West Side Story and Oliver and Sound of Music and another 20 other albums like that. So those records were part of my early listening. And then I also have very happy memories as a kid growing up. I always loved music class. I always loved singing, and I was quite good at it. But some of my favorite memories as a child include trips to nearby New York City to see professional quality dance or Broadway plays. I remember seeing the Nutcracker with the City Ballet at Lincoln Center in 4th grade. That was a life-changing experience. And similarly, seeing Broadway for the first time when I was a junior high kid, it was amazing. And I remember thinking then and there, like, I want to be on that stage. Even though I haven't been on a straight path towards becoming a theater performer since then, it's been more of a zigzag kind of journey for me. The love of singing and the love of theater, both as a fan in the audience and as a performer on stage, that has been a constant in my life.
Well, that's wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about the zig and the zag. So how did you get involved in the death industry?
Yes. Well, the short answer is I'm trained as a cantor, which is like a music minister in a Jewish synagogue. And my first pulpit, this was about 6 years ago, approximately the beginning of this Hospice Musical project. I was working at this synagogue, and like so many synagogues and churches and mosques in America, a lot of the clientele are, let's say, 50 or 60 plus. And when you have a lot of older folks, you have a lot of funerals. So I was doing a lot of funerals because we had a lot of senior citizens, 80s, 90-year-old people. And it occurred to me that I was doing my best to minister to people in their time of grief, in their intense bereavement. But I didn't think I was particularly skilled at it. That led me to the world of chaplaincy, training as a chaplain. And when you train as a chaplain, you need to have a home base. The first home base that I picked, it so happened, was a residential hospice called Center for Hope Hospice and Palliative Care. It has 2 locations in Elizabeth and Scotch Plains, New Jersey, both in Union County. not far from Newark Airport. If you don't know New Jersey, maybe that helps. And I loved it. I loved it. Hospice is challenging work, but I found it to be really positive from the beginning. Even as I was kind of learning my way and learning some of those most basic skills that a chaplain needs to learn, I found that the experience of visiting people in their dying days, to be with their loved ones, it was a holy experience. It was a meaningful experience. And it was often a joyful experience, which surprises people. But that is something that I try to bring across in my musical, which is, by the way, a musical comedy, because there's so much joy and so much laughter in hospice. It's not just the sadness of dying. People are surprised by that, but I remembered that from the very beginning, that I was visiting with people, and yes, there's some sadness about their impending death or the impending death of their loved one, but also, if we are lucky, especially with hospice care, we have this opportunity to celebrate a life well lived before the funeral. And that's something that I always loved being part of.
Oh, absolutely. That sounds awesome. I want to ask you a question about, and I ask everybody this on this podcast. What were your experiences with death growing up? What did you remember about it? Were you afraid of it? Did your parents talk openly about it? Did you go to funerals or anything like that when you were younger?
Sure. So I'll start with the last question first. I attended my grandma Charlotte's funeral when I was a relatively young kid. I think I might have been 10 or 11 at the time, third grade, because there's a whole story with it that I was going to be going to. Well, I mentioned a lifelong love of musical theater, so this actually ties into that in a neat little way, in that we were going to do a class trip to see the dress rehearsal of the high school musical. You following? So the elementary kids would get to see a dress rehearsal, and it gives the high school kids a chance to perform. And I was excited about this because I loved plays. Well, just as we're getting ready to go, we get word from the office, Benjamin should come to the office because, his grandma died and he should go home. And then I said, well, I want to go on my trip anyhow. And they gave word to the office. I was going to kind of go because I just wanted to go. And then something broke when we were sent to the restroom, go pee before the bus comes. And some classmate of mine found me crying in the bathroom and said, what's the matter? And I said, I just found out that my grandma died. And he was like, oh, you should go home. and so then I went home. So if there's a moral of the story, folks, if you hear your grandma died, don't go to the play. Just kidding. If you want to go to the play, you should go to the play.
Just don't go to the bathroom.
Right, but you should definitely listen to your body and relieve yourself at least once or twice a day. All joking aside, and I'll probably continue to make jokes throughout the interview, but when I worked as a pulpit cantor, I often would say in a subtle way, like, folks, we're going to begin the funeral in just a few minutes. We encourage you to use the restroom if you haven't recently. And then I'd make some quip like, I know it sounds like an elementary school teacher before a field trip, but a lot of folks, when they're dealing with burying their loved ones, they're not paying attention to their own basic needs. So first free tip of the podcast is, whether you're young, medium, or old, if you're dealing with the impending death of a loved one or the recent death of a loved one or going to a funeral, be sure to also mind your basic bodily needs. You need to pee and poop. You need to eat and drink. You need to sleep. And if you don't do those things, your body starts to fall apart. You feel like you're falling apart because your heart is broken when you're grieving and it's raw. but you still need to take care of yourself and eat and drink and all of that. So I would I would sometimes find myself in this funny role, a little bit chaplain, a little bit cantor, and a little bit teacher, to remind the people in that moment of need, like, listen, you know, you're burying your father today and you need the restroom. So yes, folks, while you're listening to the podcast, by the way, if you gotta go, I won't be offended if you press pause and go relieve yourself and then come back after all this bathroom talk. Yeah, sorry about that, Lisa.
No, it's good. It's good to give it practical tips woven in. I like it. So your grandmother died and you cried. What were you feeling when you were crying? Did you have a close relationship with her? Were you
not super close? I think it was the shock. I think it was I think as a 7 or 8 year old, you understand that it's sad when someone dies. I only had at that point 2 grandparents because my mother's parents, one had died way before I was even born. And I think my maternal grandma died when I was like 2 years old. So in elementary school, I only knew my dad's parents. And so, you know, having only 2 and losing one of them, I guess, is a big deal. The second grandparent, my grandpa Bernie, was much more painful in that I watched over a period of spread out visits his long decline in the hospital. That was painful to see. I was also quite a bit closer with my grandfather, just on a personal basis than I had been with my grandma. I do remember at my grandmother's funeral, though, watching for the first time ever, seeing my father cry openly and see my grandfather cry openly. Both strong, cisgender, heterosexual, heteronormative men who tended not to ever be seen crying. And they both cried openly on that day and several days following, you know, at the Shiva Minions, which is what the Jews call the little prayer services that happen in the home. So I remember seeing my grandpa weep openly during those services as well. So that was interesting for me because you're kind of aware as a kid of this idea that death occurs. You know, you see a movie like Charlotte's Web, or, you know, you might have, in our family, we were rather hapless aquarium owners, so there were a lot of dead goldfish in our lives. Actually, now that I mention that, I recently became, in my adulthood, the proud owner of an aquarium that kills fish. So for all of you listeners out there, watch out for aquariums. If you're not ready to deal with death and dying, do not buy fish. That's my second tip of the day.
Nice. So you had some general idea about death. It doesn't sound like it was a big theme other than, you know, your grandparents, your grandmother, then your grandfather, although the grandfather sounds like it was more dragged out.
It was dragged out, and actually what I did see up close with Grandpa Bernie's death was the effect of prolonged illness and, let's say, unresolved grief spiraling into mental illness and depression. So without oversharing, I'll just say that my dad had a very difficult time, as one might expect, watching his father become progressively more ill and then eventually die in a hospital I want to say 8 or 9 months after an accident that occurred at our home. So that sort of story, unfortunately, is not uncommon in today's world of hospitalized care. And I think seeing that experience up close, and how it wasn't very good for any of the people involved, not my dad or his sister, my aunt, and certainly not for the quality of life for the last 8 months of my grandfather's life.
So he was in the hospital for those 8 months?
Right. So he took a fall in our backyard and was taken away in an ambulance. He had fractured part of his spine, and slightly heavy set man, so a small fall caused a lot of injury, some bruised ribs. And then when you're in your late 70s and you're a little heavy, a lot of the systems are already kind of teetering on the brink. So one thing led to another, and he was hospitalized, sadly, until his death. So I saw him maybe 5 or 6 times, spread out, maybe 1 month at a time before the final goodbye visit. My father commuted into New York City and watched this process day by day for nearly a year, and it kind of wrecked him emotionally.
Well, I can imagine.
So the experience of seeing my dad wrecked by grief, and then unfortunately dealing with sort of a related case of acute depression related to this grief, it was very difficult and confusing. It wasn't even really explained very well at the time, which may help to explain why as an adult now it's become a passion of mine to help people give voice to their feelings, especially around the pain of grief and loss. Because it can be so debilitating, but if we don't have the nerve, or even nerve is kind of a judgy word, but let's say if we choose not to, or if we forget to share what's happening, if we are dealing with private grief and we choose not to tell people, we might unknowingly send a whole lot of pain to people around us. And that was the experience that I lived through. Of course, I was sad that my grandpa had died. It wasn't my own father. But what really devastated our family was how the grief hurt my father, who then suffered so much. So if we all think about our own lives, it's often not the fact of the death, but how it shakes relationships, or just shakes the very being of those who survive the loved one's death, whether it's the spouse or the adult child, or God forbid, the parent of a child who dies. How do we survive? How do we go on living even when the person we love has died? And in the extra sad case of a prolonged illness, when we've watched them suffer in a way that we never would wish on our worst enemy. That's a particularly thorny trauma that people go through. So I would say that was an experience that is sad, and I've certainly talked about and processed quite a bit in my chaplaincy training, because we all have to, those of us who go into the death industry specifically, but even chaplaincy more general, we need to be really well versed in our own story, because it's going to impact how we react to the stories of others.
Right. And I can see how this early experience put a seed in you to be a voice and to lift the heaviness of the energy with maybe just conversation, and then eventually music, and just how music can really lift.
With comedy, with stories.
Yep.
All different ways to shine a light in an area that you probably know all too well, given the work you do with this podcast. A lot of us are taught that death should be shrouded in darkness and mystery and spookiness. And yes, I will concede that there is a lot of mystery around death, because, all the people who go through it, they can't give us useful accounts. So the joke goes, probably the original was funnier than that one. But, there is undeniably a mystery about it. And certainly there are reasons to feel afraid because of the mystery. But I also think that there are opportunities for celebration, for honor and respect, that, frankly, a lot of cultures around the world outside of the U.S. do better than we do.
Right.
I'm wondering, Lisa, if you've ever had someone on your program talking about Coco.
Oh, the movie? No.
Oh my God, it's so good.
I really love it.
Have you ever seen it though?
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
So I love it, both because it's about death and dying, and also because it's about musicians and songwriters.
And losing your voice.
Losing your voice and finding your voice. And oh my God, so much good stuff. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I love it. So this is a good segue then to say, let's start talking about what was the inspiration for Life Review, the Hospice Musical? How did this get started for you?
This musical started with songs, and the songs started with stories. I was a hospice chaplain intern, just beginning that adventure of caring and learning and visiting that a beginner chaplain does. And one of the biggest things you do is you sit bedside. Of course, this is COVID days. You sit bedside, and if the person is able to speak, you ask them questions to help them offer stories of their life. This process, it's a clinical technique, and it's called Life Review. So that phrase, Life Review, I borrowed for the name of my musical and the name of one of the songs that you might hear tonight or today. Those Life Review conversations resulted in amazing stories. I remembered meeting people who had interesting jobs, a guy who claimed to be former Mossad and CIA, another person who was, I was just an automotive repairman, but I paid my mortgage and I put my daughters all the way into college, very proud about his life of work. People who had been teachers, professors, labor organizers, you name it. So some people might have had glamorous lives, some people had simple lives, but the common thread, of course, is that the questions of these Life Review interviews or Life Review conversations, they helped these people provide a beautiful highlight reel of their whole life. So I would drive home just kind of filled with wonder and reverence for these stories. One night I called my wife. I said, "Sweetie, these stories I'm hearing bedside, they're amazing. I think they want to be songs." She said, "Well, get writing." So that night I opened up one of those black and white journal books and I started sketching out in my chicken scratch handwriting some lyrics that would become the first song in the musical, the ballad, "Will It Still Snow When I'm Gone?"
I love that. I love that moment of inspiration that sets you on a path. It's amazing. So what song, is that the one where you're asking the questions?
The one where I'm asking the questions is Life Review. Okay. And if you'd like, I could definitely do that.
Ooh, I love that.
So I mentioned before the name of the musical is Life Review. So, of course, you need a title track. I wrote a song by that same name, Life Review. And as you and your listeners listen, I encourage you to hear these questions and see if you can imagine yourself lying down in a bed or maybe sitting in an easy chair. If you don't want it to be your deathbed, maybe it's just like your old man or your old lady chair. And think about how you might answer these questions as you look back on your own life, as you do your own life review. You might also find yourself thinking about the life of someone you recently lost and how you answered the questions on their behalf. But I hope you enjoy it. The name of the song, again, is Life Review. I wrote the words, and the music is by my friend and composer, Michael Miller. Hi, I'm the chaplain. Can I come and visit with you? Tell me, who are you? What did you do? Where did you go? Who did you know? Who did you love? Who did you lose? When you had a choice, how did you choose? So tell me a story, give a glimmer of your glory, how you got to here and now. I am here to hear you now. We are here to hear you now. Life review, sing of joys and heartbreaks. We can hear your voice even as it fades. Life review, through all the triumphs and the sorrows, with more yesterdays than tomorrows. Time to do a life review. Tell me about your mom and dad. What was the best job you had? And how about when your health got bad? And when did you feel fine? Where did you live and where did you move to? What were the records you used to groove to? Is the time enough to ask all that I must? You can tell me your secrets if I earn your trust. What are you proud of? Are you carrying shame? Did you ever get married? What was their name? Too soon, I have to go. Too soon, you have to go. But now, life review, sing of joys and heartbreaks. We can hear your voice even as it fades. Life review, through all the triumphs and the sorrows, with more yesterdays than tomorrows. Time to do a life review, sing of joys and heartbreaks. We can hear your voice even as it fades. Life review, through all the triumphs and the sorrows, with more yesterdays than tomorrows. Time to do a little life review.
Wow. I love that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for listening.
Are you on Clubhouse? I feel like I'm asking everybody that nowadays. Well, originally it was just for Apple, and now they've opened it up for Android. So Clubhouse is an app. It's an audio-only social media. It's really different from any other social media. I can tell you more about that later, but I do want to let you know on Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time, I open up a room called Positive Death Talk, and I have a Positive Death Talk club on Clubhouse. And if you'd like to just come and talk about different topics that pertain to the topic of death, I welcome you or invite you to come and check it out. So it's Tuesday nights on Clubhouse, and just search Positive Death Talk Club, and then you'll find it there. I look forward to meeting you. Let me know you heard me on the podcast, and I look forward to talking with you. Music is so, it softens us, you know, it goes past all the mind barriers, and it gets right into who we are. And either it makes you sad or makes you happy, gives you energy. I mean, it just really moves things along. It's just so interesting. What a clever way to get people to think about all of this, which we should all be thinking about at some point. So, wow.
So I'm gonna be so bold as to put my host on the spot and ask you.
Okay, yeah, I'll sing. Life no, I was kidding.
Oh,
I'm
if
not
you've got the hook, then congratulations, Michael. You successfully wrote an earworm. I mean, I did double it at the end, so in case you forgot the melody, I sang it one more time.
Yes.
But as you heard all those questions, Lisa, I mean, have you ever done that exercise where you write your own obituary? A lot of high school kids are made to do that, which is
oh my God, no.
It may seem a little dark, but a lot of self-help books recommend it too. The idea is, in order to get down the road you hope to go down, to use that travel metaphor, you have to imagine what the destination is. Certainly business people know about this, and good teachers worth their salt. They think about what the kids know in June and then plan September through May accordingly, to build towards that. Anyway, where am I going with that, Lisa? I'm not sure.
Well, you're getting me and the listeners to think about applying that to our lives, even if we're not in hospice.
There you are. There's a connection. And that, folks, is why Lisa Murray hosts a podcast, because she can follow an incoherent guest and bring some coherence to the proceedings. Here's the thing, like, imagining our life. I mean, you laughed nervously when I mentioned the exercise of writing your obituary. But I'll tell you to take my own example for something that's not too deeply personal, given that I'm here promoting this musical that I've created. At a certain point in my life, I decided I think I have a musical that I want to create. And I did not know that it would take me 6 years to not yet be done with it. And that's where I'm at right now. And I didn't know it would take a team of at least 10 creative people and twice as many, financial backers and on, which I know now, and we continue to grow. But there were certain points of doubt along the way where I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And my therapist said something very powerful to me. He said, "You've done amazing work so far. I can tell you, I work with some people who spend a lot of time regretting the big thing that they never did. Mm-hmm. You are doing your big thing right now."
Yes.
And you don't know how big it'll get, and you don't know if you make it to Broadway or off Broadway, or if you only do the hospice conference circuit, or who the heck knows where this thing lands. But right. I'm proud that I've been bold enough to try to bring it to the world. Now, why I'm telling that story not just to be self-congratulatory and to shamelessly plug my virtual tour 2021, but also to say, when we, the collective we, all of us listeners, imagine our deathbed scene, or if you don't want to be that dark, let's say a family dinner at some non-specific old age with surviving friends and spouses, and if your life circumstances dictate this, children and grandchildren, if not, whoever else gathers with you. Imagine that scene, and then imagine the story you want to tell. This might also make you think of, like, It's a Wonderful Life, because that deals with similar themes about, like, the life that you want to live versus the life that you stumbled into, a life of regret, a life of intention, right? When we think about future self looking back on our current life, it makes our current decisions matter a whole lot more. And the thing is, like, a lot of times we make foolish decisions or decisions we might regret later because in the moment they feel good. And so, like, any of our hedonistic impulses, sex, drugs, rock and roll, are usually going to feel better in the moment than the next morning or the next year. We all know that. But whatever it is, if we decide that we want to look back on our life and having accomplished something of importance, it means we're going to have to put in a lot of time when we're younger than deathbed or healthier than deathbed to get it done. And it's so interesting because I did not me in for this interview to become so guidance counselor-y. I happen to be married to a wonderful guidance counselor who specializes at the moment with college counseling. And sometimes we compare notes, the middle school kids I help, the high-achieving upper-class prep school kids from Rockville who she helps. And here's the thing, they all want to make something good of their lives. They may have very different expectations. They certainly have different zip codes and different income levels. But all of us, rich or poor, young, old, beautiful, ugly, in between, we all want to make some kind of difference in the world. Maybe we want to make some money. Maybe we want to find some fame. Maybe we want to find love, affection, sexual gratification. Maybe we want to have adventures. But all of us want something to look back on with fondness and pride. And that's part of what the Life Review project is all about. That people of different types all face their death with a surprising amount of optimism and hope and, dare I say, celebration and humor, because the lives that they've lived are filled with things that are worth celebrating and, the fallible, embarrassing things that they can laugh about.
This is the end of part 1 of my interview with Benjamin Kintisch about the Life Review, the Hospice Musical. And so if you would like to hear the second half of our incredible conversation, that will be on next week's show. And thank you for listening. You can find out any show notes, or if you have any questions or you'd like to submit your death story, you can do all of that on deathtalkpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.